Welcome to Mindshift. I'm Brandon. Today is episode 1 of my brand new series, Beyond the Bible, where we look at anything and everything outside of the Protestant canon. Today's episode will be on the Book of Tobit, but before we get into it, let me zoom out and give you a series introduction here. I've gathered up 61 books that will be our next 61 episodes that have to do with ancient Jewish writings, early Christian writings, the false teachings of Christianity, anything related to this religion that was written down that again is not in the Protestant canon. Here's the breakdown for that. First, we have the 9 books of the Apocrypha, or the deuterocanonical works. These are what are found in the Catholic and Orthodox Bibles. Then we have 4 works that are specific to the Eastern Orthodox texts. Then 11 books from the Pseudepigrapha. These books were attributed to biblical figures, but they are not found in any canon. Then we have 11 Gnostic texts. These are writings from early Christian Gnosticism, which were rejected by Orthodox Christianity. Then we have 8 works from the Dead Sea Scrolls, 8 works that we're kind of putting in a miscellaneous category of early Christian writings. These were popular in the first few centuries of Christianity, but left out of the Bible ultimately. Then we have 7 that are specific to the Nag Hammadi. These are Gnostic texts found in 1945 in Egypt. And then these last 3 that I just didn't have a good category for. We'll call them additional Jewish and Christian texts. So that is our roadmap, again, for the next 61 weeks. Every Thursday, 9 a.m. Central Time, just like we did with the secular Bible study series. But again, let's go ahead and start zooming back into what we're going to start with, and we're going to start with the Apocrypha, the first of which will be Tobit. Now, Apocrypha just means hidden or secret, but it eventually came to refer to these texts that were removed during the Protestant Reformation. These writings are mostly of Jewish origin and were written in the intertestamental period, the time between the Old and the New Testaments. Again, these books are still included in the Old Testament for the Catholic and Orthodox Christians. These books were originally in the Greek Septuagint, which is the Greek version of the Old Testament. In the 16th century, it was Martin Luther who referred to this particular grouping of books as Apocrypha, and he did say they were useful for reading and studying, but they should not be on the same plane as true scripture. Many people have a false understanding of what happened at the Council of Trent, and we'll talk about that more as we get into this series. But one of the things that happened was the Catholics, in response to the Protestants, renaming this group of writings as the deuterocanonical works, a term that means second canon as opposed to proto-canonical or first. So again, these books are removed from Protestant Bibles, but they remain firmly fixed in Catholic and Orthodox Bibles. The last important thing to say here is, depending on which of these groups that I'm covering, I'll have a different outline or different features that we're going to be discussing. For instance, with the Apocrypha, I'm going to be talking about why it wasn't considered canon. We'll talk about what unique doctrines the Catholics have because of this specific book that Protestants don't. We won't be looking so much at contradictory verses, though we still will be looking at problematic passages. And I've rearranged the order a little bit for those of you that were following along from secular Bible study series. So, diving right in, episode 1, the Book of Tobit, and now point 1 is why it didn't make the Protestant canon. One of the primary reasons for Tobit's exclusion from the Protestant canon lies in the criteria reformers like Luther applied to biblical texts. Protestant reformers sought to return to the authentic Hebrew scriptures, aligning their Old Testament canon with the Hebrew Bible. That did not include Tobit. At that time, there was no original Hebrew nor Aramaic versions of this manuscript, or at least known about. The book primarily existed in Greek, and again, what will be the case for many of these books, when we look at the criteria used by Luther and others like him, this book simply didn't hold up. It's funny to think about these individuals talking about how there were features in this book, both historical and geographical, that didn't line up with truth, and so they thought it didn't mean it was divinely inspired. And then you think about the 66 books that we do have and all of the issues with them, and it's like, where was this line in the sand that was drawn? But in addition to those physical concerns, there were theological concerns with what is found in the Book of Tobit. For one, the idea that almsgiving or giving to the poor can deliver one from death and will purge away every sin. Now, even Catholics will argue about the interpretation of this, but from a Protestant point of view, we just couldn't have this. That is works-based salvation, and that is not what Luther and the others like him were all about. Another really interesting tidbit here comes from the early church father or scholar Jerome. This is 4th century. Jerome was working on translating the Hebrew and Greek text into the Latin Vulgate. And here he was pretty concerned with Tobit and said, it's useful for edification, as it had some pretty things to say on marriage, family, and charity, but not for forming doctrine. Again, the earliest signs of cherry picking. So Jerome's ambivalence here meant that while Tobit was still in the Vulgate, it held an ambiguous state, if you will, until later theological debates. But the Catholic Church continued to hold on to Tobit as scripture, noting its use for moral and theological importance. Again, at the Council of Trent in 1546, it officially gets its place, or gets to remain in its place, I should say, as many early Christians would have been reading this, preaching and teaching from this, studying this for all of the insights in the same way that a Protestant looks at their Bible today. But one of the main arguments from the Catholics, specifically from Cardinal Cajetan, was that this book had been included for so long already, and thus deserved canonical status. Why not? Why make a change now? It's got good spiritual lessons. We like the theology that comes from it. And also it's really relatable, which is a funny thing to say about this book. Yes, some of the struggles the characters go through, specifically the two characters that are longing for death, that are just done with their suffering, I get why it's identifiable. But when you hear the insanity of the rest of this story and buckle up, to say that this represents humans in a timeless way is pretty darn silly. And why we're talking about that, and then we're going to move right into point 2. I think one of the funniest things that you can look at is showing these books to a Protestant Christian. They didn't grow up with these Bible stories, so they haven't made all the excuses for them, and they're not considered scripture to them. Someone that wasn't them drew a line in the sand and said, these aren't from God in the same way that these are. And so Protestant Christians, when they're introduced to these stories, like the one we get of a virgin who's been married 7 times, but a demon kills the groom on the wedding night before they can consummate, they think that's so dumb, that's so silly. And that story is in this book. Or when that is finally defeated because of the magical properties of a certain fish that an archangel comes down in human form to help our protagonist get, they just say, this is too much nonsense, this is too silly. But then they have no problem with the talking donkey or the worldwide flood, the magical blood that you bathe in that makes you white as snow, and everything else that is found in their Bible. It is dissonance at the highest level. Let's move on to segment 2, which is now going to be authorship and date and any necessary context for understanding when and why this book was written. The traditional view is that Tobit is attributed to Tobit himself, or maybe we could say a later scribe that compiled his life story. However, very similar to what we see with the first 5 books of the Protestant canon, it doesn't seem to make much sense when you consider that Tobit is written in the third person, kind of like how people believe Moses wrote about his own death. Scholars date the book between the 3rd and 2nd century BCE, even though it seems to be telling a story that is in the 8th century BCE. But most likely this is being written during the Hellenistic period. The precise authorship is not known, it is not guessed at, but it does seem to be a Jewish writer, probably in the diaspora, with hints that maybe it's coming from Egypt or Mesopotamia. From a context perspective, it does seem to represent Jewish life outside of Israel, in a time where these Jewish communities were scattered and faced many cultural pressures that they wouldn't have if they, again, remained inside Israel's walls itself. Again, the narrative puts the story in the 8th century BCE, specifically in Nineveh, Assyria, under King Shalmaneser, and then his successor Sennacherib, which I can never say. However, again, we have plenty of historical inaccuracies that seem to make this story more symbolic than actual or realistic. The manuscript tradition here, I think, is really interesting. So we have surviving copies in Greek, of course, and in Latin, but also in Aramaic, and some fragments in Hebrew. These come from the Dead Sea Scrolls and were a later find in Qumran, and it provided additional insight into these texts. But it's funny that one of the main reasons that it was scrapped from the canon was for the very reason we didn't have any manuscript tradition in these languages. Also, among the Greek manuscripts that we have 2 versions, long and short, which leads to debates about which is the original and which is most trustworthy. That hopefully sets the stage a bit better for the context, the authorship, the date, all of the things that are now going to be considered point 2. So we can move into point 3, which you're very familiar with, which is book overview, where we're going to go bunch by bunch and create some segments for us to work through. We're going to do this in 5 segments. Segment 1 is going to be chapters 1 and 2. And now we're going to walk through what you get when you read the Book of Tobit, because I know that many of you, unlike the last 66 books, will be completely unfamiliar with this. I'm also anticipating anticipating many Catholic listeners now tuning in that will tell me how I'm so incorrect, how I'm still holding on to my Protestant bias. I, of course, do come from the Protestant background, and these books were foreign to me, even though I did read them out of pure curiosity. And the theology that I accepted did not accept these books or their versions of doctrine that I saw as conflicting. And so, yes, that bias is there, but as an ex-Christian, I just don't think it's going to factor in. So, a summary of these first two chapters. Tobit is a devout and righteous Israelite of the tribe of Naphtali who remains faithful to God's laws despite living in exile in Nineveh under Assyrian rule. In these early chapters, we see his devotion to Jewish tradition, to their customs, which include burial of fellow Jews who have died without proper rites. Again, we're starting to get into that Catholic theology. His steadfastness, though, and his devotion are highlighted here against this backdrop of adversity that Tobit is going to face. So the story goes, these good deeds of Tobit put him at odds with the pagan surroundings. You know, people who think differently, people with different customs and cultures, but always looked at and looked down at by Christians, Catholics, Jews, etc. And then comes, like all good stories, even though he's such a good person, why is this bad thing happening? And Tobit becomes blind in a very strange way when bird droppings fall onto his eyes. Segment 2 here, chapters 3 and 4, moves the story along nicely, albeit a very dark turn. Now blind and impoverished, he grows despondent. He feels like a burden to his wife Anna, who accuses him of hypocrisy when he questions how she acquired a goat. Tobit prays for death, asking God to take his life. Simultaneously, Sarah, a young woman in Ecbatana, prays for death as well after suffering the loss of 7 husbands due to the demon Asmodeus. Again, this demon is killing each of her husbands on the wedding night before they can consummate, leaving her a virgin. Both prayers reach God, and this is where we get the concept of the archangel, specifically in this story, Raphael. God sends Raphael because he hears these prayers to intervene. So, Tobit, who's been blinded by bird poop, and Anna, who has lost 7 husbands because of a demon who, in the first case ever, doesn't want a young woman to lose her virginity. And these are our 2 main characters that we're supposed to take seriously. Both of them so upset with their station in life that they pray for death. This is again where many Catholics will point to this book as useful for even today, a timeless appeal to the suffering of man, even if these particular sufferings can't be very relatable. But suffering is suffering nonetheless, and the vulnerability to speak with God and tell him about how hard your struggles are, and even a desire for death. Well, these things are not lost upon God, who hears you and will send help. And the way that he does so is pretty unique in this particular story. Moving into segment 3, chapters 5 and 6, Tobit, believing his life is nearing its end, sends his son Tobiah on a journey to recover a large sum of money that he left in the care of Gabriel, a relative who lives in the distant city of Rages in Media. Unbeknownst to Tobiah, his traveling companion is actually the angel Raphael, sent by God to protect him and guide him. This is when Raphael gives the very mysterious advice to Tobiah to catch a fish, the organs of which will later play a very significant role. Also, I should note, and this comes from Tobit 6, that the fish actually attacks Tobiah first. This happens right in the Tigris River. And only once Raphael tells him does Tobiah supposedly fight back or catch the fish and then perform this dissection to take its organs. He does go as far to tell him these are going to be used for both healing and exorcism. It's always funny to see too, we have so much experience with this going through the Protestant canon, the Catholics who definitely believe in things like exorcism, but never specifically utilizing any kind of fish organ to do so. No, that's just symbolic, or even those that believe that this story is literal. It's just for this time and place. So we're going to believe in demons. We're going to believe in exorcisms. We're going to believe in specific named demons who do specific harm in different ways. We'll take all of that from these stories, but we'll just leave some of the parts that we don't like or don't make sense or seem a little bit more crazy than the others. I just think it's fascinating. Also, like a good guy, Raphael starts preparing Tobiah for his encounter with Sarah. He reveals that she is destined to be his wife. So much for the free will of those first 7 husbands. Again, an angel saying that this woman is destined to be his wife, meaning fated, meaning predestined, meaning willed by God, means that God had these 7 other men marry her, knowing what would happen to them, allowing a demon to kill them, by the way. Again, this raises so many theological issues, just so that our 2 lovers can meet, blessed by the fish guts, which Raphael assures him will work. Don't worry, we've got the magical fish, we're good. Which leads us to segment 4, chapters 7 through 9. Tobiah and Raphael arrive at the home of Raguel, Sarah's father. Tobiah asks for Sarah's hand in marriage, as Raphael instructed him to do. Although Raguel is initially hesitant, fearing for Tobiah's life, he agrees to the marriage, which also, I think, makes him a bit insane. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. We're now leading into the 8th time. What level of insanity does this father have in continuing to try out these marriages? But again, he agrees to the marriage. So on the wedding night, Tobiah, like he has been taught to do by an angel himself, burns the fish's heart and liver, producing a certain kind of smoke that drives the demon away. That's all it took. We're not going to use God's name. We're going to use magical rituals, spells, essentially. This is witchcraft, is it not? What is the difference? That an angel suggested it? I just don't see the distinction. But as this drives out the demon, guess what? Raphael gets to capture it, showing us a very physical spiritual warfare that is ever present. And then, don't worry, we get to know that these 2 finally get to consummate. And being a cool wingman, no pun intended, Raphael lets them stay in their marital honeymoon bliss, and he goes and fetches the money that Tobiah was supposed to get. He returns with the money, he did his job, Tobiah has now done his job, and also got this new bride, they've captured a demon. It's a buddy cop story as good as any. Which leads us to our final segment, segment 5, chapters 10 through 14. Tobiah and Sarah return home to Nineveh, where Tobit has been waiting anxiously. Upon their arrival, Tobiah uses the gall of the fish to heal his father's blindness, just as Raphael had instructed. The family rejoices in their newfound prosperity and healing. Raphael then reveals his true identity as one of the 7 archangels who stand before God, instructing Tobit and Tobiah to continue living righteous lives. The book concludes with Tobit's final psalm of praise, his advice to his family, and his eventual death at the ripe old age of 158. It is a true, happy ending in every single sense. And that is the story of Tobit. Let's move on to point 4, literary analysis. Then we'll get into some main themes and we'll talk about some of the more problematic parts, even though I think we already covered quite a few. Genre-wise, Tobit is often classified as a religious novella or a wisdom tale. It's this weird blend of traditional wisdom literature with folklore. And again, the debate among if one should take this seriously, literally, historically, or not is ever going. You get so many historical details about Nineveh, its eventual destruction, who the kings were at that time, the names of specific rivers. So why, in this setting, all of a sudden have other parts of myth, magical fish, archangels. And again, if that is going to be myth, which is fine. I mean, many would compare that to Spider-Man being based in New York. Just because you list certain streets in New York doesn't mean Spider-Man is real. But Catholics believe that Raphael is real. They believe that he is one of the 7 archangels, as mentioned. Now we're inserting more literal characters into the Jewish family, which seems to be the most realistic of them all, out scattered amongst Israel. But now all of a sudden we're supposed to believe that these individual characters didn't really exist. It seems like the story is, yes, meant to convey wisdom of a certain kind, but based off the real life instances, similar to Job, I think, would be a good Protestant analogy. Protestant Christians really believe there was a man, Job. They really believed that he had this encounter with God, that this bet with Satan really occurred, that his children really died, and his wife and friends turned on him, that he knelt before God as God bragged and boasted about all his magical, wonderful, and powerful creations, only to finally break Job and then restore his wealth and children. That story is just as ludicrous and yet meant to be taken literally, even with its metaphorical wisdom themes. I see the Book of Tobit very similarly, but I'm off on a tangent here. That's just talking about genre. The structure is very nice in this book. We get a really linear time frame, as you saw in the segments that I was able to break down. We have just a few main characters. They all serve their purpose and no more. We have a lot of symbolism and motif and theme going on. Some of the motifs like angelic assistance, which again, not not believed in by Protestants, but much more important within the Catholic side of things. The triumph of faith, the reversal of fortunes, where God turns suffering into joy, again, giving hope. Just continue to do the right thing, continue to believe, continue to talk to God. Also, this divine guidance that we get from Raphael. In terms of style, we get really simple and direct prose, which is pretty nice. There is some poetry here, specifically the prayers made by Tobit and Sarah at the beginning, and then of course the psalm at the end. We have all of these supernatural elements as well. Magical fish, birds sent by God to create suffering, exorcisms, binding demons, archangels, prayers that are literally listened to by God, who then specifically sends helpers down to intervene. But what is it all for? What are the main themes that we're supposed to pick out from a book like this? I think the first one, and even though I would see it as incredibly problematic, would be divine providence. This is God's doing. God is driving this whole thing. He decides who he's blessing, who he's cursing. He's allowing this demon to continue to do this thing to the grooms of this woman. He sends down an angel. He chooses when the angel is disguised and when it is revealed. He chooses when to finally let this woman's husband survive. He chooses when to restore the blindness. God's providence or sovereignty, I think, is inescapable for a theme here. Faith in adversity, which is funny because what we actually see is almost a giving up of both Tobit and Sarah. Sure, we see them hang on. They don't actually kill themselves, but it seems to be clearly out of fear. Sarah fears what it would do to her family. It's not this beautiful faith in God, and yet it is rewarded as such. Just continue to have faith in adversity. Maybe the pointing to the fact that they're still speaking with God in their adversity, in their suffering, is a greater point here. This book really stresses the importance of almsgiving. We didn't talk about that as much, but doing your due diligence, taking care of the poor, even at one's own risk or peril. And lastly, and lesser, might be familial loyalty. This is a book of family responsibility, what a daughter owes her father, or what a son owes his dad. And again, there are some pretty parts here. In fact, within Catholic weddings, there is very often a verse read from Tobit about the unity of marriage and the man taking his wife not just as a thing that he's lusting for. I will say, even though there's a lot of other problematic parts, that's a nice standout for once. Let's move on to our final point, point 6 here, and talk about problematic passages. Now, it's interesting. We may get into contradictions, and I tried to call out quite a few contradictions already between what Protestants believe and what Catholics believe and why this book doesn't count. But since Protestants don't view this book as scripture, it seems unnecessary to me to talk about contradictions between them. In fact, it seems kind of unnecessary to talk about problematic passages, and I may not continue with it for some of the other books. But since a large portion of Christians are Catholics, and since Catholics believe in these books and get much of their doctrine from these books, I want to go ahead and specifically talk about some of these still more unjust, immoral, problematic verses that we see in these books. So here's a few from Tobit. The first one being Tobit 12:9, almsgiving for salvation. Again, the passage is, almsgiving delivers from death, and it will purge away every sin. I don't know how you can get around what that verse is clearly indicating. It almost looks like not only is it based off works, but that essentially one could buy their way to salvation. And then when you consider the unfairness of the lack of free will, despite whatever biblical sense we get of it, that would lead many people to have a much better chance at earning their salvation than others. This is riddled with issue, and one that is highly contested, again, even amongst Catholics. There's many verses we could use for my next point, but Tobit 6:4-9, then the angel told him to open the fish and take out its gall, heart, and liver. The gall will restore a person's sight who is blind. And again, we know the heart and liver are going to be burned to create smoke that drives away a demon so that Raphael in secret form can capture and bind him. All very strange, very unnecessary for an all-powerful God. Why does he have to work this way, in the way that many other customs and cultures at the time were working or believing in or making stories about? It just seems like more superstition, more magic, or whatever you want to call it, though the Catholics hold on to things like exorcism, not to say that Protestants don't, just in a different way. You don't see Catholics out fishing on Saturday to make sure they have the necessary instruments to perform these rituals. And yet, Catholics and Christians alike will still take other verses where we have kind of these magical ceremonial things and perform them exactly as stated in the books of the Bible. Communion comes to mind as just one example. So again, a very strange picking and choosing. I think one thing that's interesting to think about is the implications of Tobit 5:13. I am Azariah, the son of the great Hananiah, one of your kinsmen. This is a lie. Raphael is deliberately deceiving Tobiah. This could have been done in so many ways without outright deceiving. Why does God have to play these kinds of tricks? What good does it do? I think it sets a really dangerous and harmful ideal that the ends can justify the means. I'm not saying that one should never lie or there's never a good use case, but I do think that it should be limited. And I think the God of all creation shouldn't have to trick those who are already worshiping and following him, even if it is just to help them eventually. Again, I think it's a slippery slope. I think one of the biggest and most ridiculous things when it comes to God's nature here is what we get, and I mentioned this before, but I'll throw it up on the screen, Tobit 3:8. The demon named Asmodeus had killed each of Sarah's 7 husbands before they could consummate the marriage. Mixing that with the verse where we hear from Raphael himself that Tobiah is destined, that again paints a really ugly picture of God playing chess with humans. He has a story he wants to tell. He has an end he wants to reach, and many of us are nothing more than collateral damage along the way. Again, I do not see how one could escape this when you have verses like this in what you consider to be scripture. We get something again very similar to Job, but an issue from Tobit 1:20. Because I feared God with all my heart, the Most High allowed this misfortune to happen to me. Again, Tobit is suggesting that his misfortune is directly linked to his great faith. And again, we see that Job's misfortune was directly linked to Job's great righteousness. What kind of God does this? But again, we have other issues we could point to here for the pretty things that are said about marriage in some of the marriage feast passages. We also see some really unfortunate stereotypes. We have more issues with the disguised deception of Raphael, but I think I'm going to leave it alone. I wanted these episodes to be shorter than my SBS episodes, but we had so much we needed to do to intro this new series, so let's end it here. I hope that you're excited to go through these books. I am excited to go through all 61 of them with you. Now only 60 to go. Thank you so much for being here. Let me know what you think about this new series. If you have any suggestions for a better way to approach these books than what I've gone ahead and done for episode 1, I'd love to hear it now before we get too far into the series. Thanks again. I will see you Sunday with what I am so excited for. I think one of my most important episodes on what I am calling the in-between, that hardest part of the journey in deconstruction. Until then, keep thinking. I'd like to personally thank my top tiers of support: my Iconoclast, Ann, Boris GVI, Jason, Joe, Kaboga, Perry, Rocket, Sean, and Strong Rex; my Humanist Heroes, Imposter, James, Jared, Christy, and Thronus; my Atheist Advocates, Caleb, David, Jeff, Jeffrey, Mrs. Webb, Paul, Sparky, and Todd; as well as all of my Secular Scholar patrons. If you believe in the mission of this channel or you just enjoy its content, please consider joining these fine people.